November 27th, 1978. San Francisco City Hall gleams in the California sun, its golden dome a promise of democracy that will be broken tomorrow. Inside, the corridors echo with footsteps of politicians, activists, citizens who believe the system works. They don't know that Dan White spent last night loading his service revolver, counting bullets like a rosary. They don't know that tomorrow, 2 men will die in these halls, and America will learn that hatred doesn't always announce itself with burning crosses and white hoods. Sometimes it wears a 3-piece suit and climbs through basement windows. The assassin doesn't see himself as an assassin yet. He's a former cop, former fireman, former supervisor who just wants his job back. Dan White sits in his home in the Visitation Valley, that working-class neighbourhood where Irish-American families still believe in the American dream, even as it slips through their fingers. His Police .38 special lies on the kitchen table next to his resignation letter, the one he wishes he'd never written. Tomorrow, he thinks, Mayor Moscone will make things right. Tomorrow everything goes back to normal. But tomorrow never works out the way desperate men plan. To understand this execution, we must understand the stage. San Francisco, 1978. The city transforms itself from port town to gay mecca, from working-class enclave to cultural revolution. The Castro district blooms with rainbow flags and possibility. Men hold hands on the street without looking over their shoulders. For the first time in American history, you can be openly gay and openly powerful. This terrifies some people, thrills others. Dan White can't decide which he feels. Harvey Milk arrived in San Francisco in 1972 with long hair, a new boyfriend, and a camera store dream. The Bronx-born Navy veteran, former Goldwater supporter, becomes something else entirely on Castro Street. He cuts his hair, buys a suit, learns to work a crowd. They call him the mayor of Castro Street, but he wants more. He wants power, not for its own sake, but for what it can protect, what it can change. You've got to give them hope, he says. Hope is a dangerous thing to give people who've been taught to hide. George Moscone, son of the Marina District, climbs the political ladder with Italian-American charm and progressive ideals. State senator, majority leader, mayor. He opposes the freeways that would gut San Francisco's neighborhoods, supports gay rights when it's political suicide, wins the 1975 mayoral race by 4,000 votes. Jim Jones and the People's Temple deliver those votes. This detail will matter later, when everything unravels, when we look for reasons in the wreckage. And Dan White, born in the shadow of San Francisco, one of 9 children in an Irish Catholic family that believed in God, country, and keeping your problems to yourself. Vietnam veteran, Kofdorf firefighter, the resume of a man who serves, who saves, who protects. But something curdles inside him. Maybe it started in Vietnam, maybe earlier. By 1977, he runs for supervisor as a Democrat, talks about cleaning up the city, making it safe for families. He wins. Harvey Milk wins too. They're sworn in together, 2 sides of San Francisco's schizophrenic soul. The Board of Supervisors in 1978 is an experiment in democracy. District elections replace at-large voting. Suddenly, neighborhoods have voices. Gordon Lau, first Chinese-American supervisor, Carol Ruth Silver, single mother, Ella Hill Hutch, first African-American woman, Harvey Milk, first openly gay everything, and Dan White, representing the old San Francisco that watches its city change and doesn't know whether to adapt or fight. White and Milk start as allies, or something close to it. White invites Milk to his son's christening. Milk shows White around the Castro, introduces him to constituents who are just people, not the perverts and deviants of White's Catholic upbringing. They vote together sometimes, oppose each other more often, but there's respect, even friendship. At least that's what everyone tells themselves. It's easier than admitting what simmers beneath. The salary of a supervisor, $9,600 a year. In San Francisco, that barely covers rent. Dan White opens a baked potato stand on Pier 39, the hot potato. He works 18-hour days, potatoes and politics, trying to stay afloat. Harvey Milk has his camera store, his community, his cause. George Moscone has the mayor's mansion. Dan White has debts mounting like accusations. November 10th, 1978. Dan White submits his resignation. The financial pressure, the political pressure, the pressure of being Dan White in a city that's leaving him behind, it all becomes too much. I can't support my family, he tells reporters, but within hours he regrets it. His supporters beg him to reconsider. His wife cries. His identity as Supervisor Dan White is all he has left. Without it, He's just another failed cop with a failed potato stand. The next week, chaos. November 18th. News breaks that 900 members of the People's Temple have committed mass suicide in Jonestown, Guyana. Jim Jones, who helped elect George Moscone, has led his followers to death. San Francisco reels. In the horror and confusion, Dan White's resignation becomes yesterday's news. But White doesn't care about Jonestown. He cares about getting his job back. The power lies with Moscone. The mayor can reappoint White or choose someone else. At first, Moscone leans toward reappointment. Why not? Keep the peace. Avoid controversy. But Harvey Milk has other ideas. He lobbies Moscone hard. White is unstable, reactionary. A vote against everything progressive San Francisco is becoming. Choose someone else. Anyone else. Moscone listens. This decision signs his death warrant. November 26th. Moscone tells allies he won't reappoint White. The news filters through City Hall's gossip network. Dan White hears it from a reporter, not even from Moscone himself. The humiliation burns. That night, White doesn't sleep. He cleans his gun, a ritual from his police days. Load, unload, load again. His wife asks what's wrong. Nothing, he says. Everything, he means. November 27th, Monday morning. White calls his aide, needs a ride to City Hall. She doesn't question it. Why would she? At City Hall, White doesn't use the main entrance. He knows there are metal detectors now. Security, since the radical movements of the 60s and 70s, made government buildings targets. Instead, he goes to a basement window he knows from his supervisor days. It's always unlocked. He climbs through, his service revolver heavy in his pocket, 10 hollow-point bullets. He only needs 5. The mayor's office. Moscone meets with Willie Brown, future mayor, current power broker. White asks for a meeting. Moscone agrees. One last courtesy to a former colleague. They meet in the formal office first. White pleads his case. Moscone stays firm. The decision is made. White's face changes, something Moscone recognizes from his years in politics. The face of a man with nothing left to lose. Let's go into the back room, Moscone suggests. Have a drink, calm down. The mayor's private lounge, where deals are made, where bourbon smooths over political wounds. Moscone pours 2 drinks. Dan White pulls out his gun. 4 shots, 2 to the body, dropping Moscone to the floor. Then White stands over him, puts the gun to Moscone's head, fires twice more. Coup de grace, the execution touch. This isn't passion, this is ritual. White reloads, 5 bullets left. He walks down the hallway past Dianne Feinstein. I have something to do first, he tells her when she tries to talk. She notices he looks strange, agitated. She doesn't notice the blood spatter on his shirt, small enough to be overlooked, large enough to be evidence. White knows exactly where he's going. Harvey Milk is in the supervisor's offices talking to an aide about problems with the mental health facilities. Dan White appears in the doorway. Harvey, can I talk to you? Milk follows him to White's former office, the office he'll never get back now. According to White's later testimony, he begs Milk to help him, to intervene with Moscone. Milk smirks, or White thinks he does. That smirk, real or imagined, triggers something. 5 shots. The first drops Milk to his knees. White continues firing. The last shot, like with Moscone, is to the head. Deliberate, final, making sure. Milk falls forward, his body sprawled on the floor of the office where democracy is supposed to happen peacefully. Dan White walks out, leaves City Hall, finds a payphone, calls his wife. Meet me at St. Mary's Cathedral. Then he walks to Northern Station, his old police precinct, and turns himself in. Dianne Feinstein finds Milk's body. She checks for a pulse with her finger, touches the bullet hole. Later, she'll never forget that feeling, the absence where life should be. She becomes acting mayor in that moment, though she doesn't know it yet. First, she has to tell the city its leaders are dead. The announcement to the press is chaos. Someone screams, "Jesus Christ!" Others sob. Feinstein's voice shakes but doesn't break. Both Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk have been shot and killed. The suspect is Supervisor Dan White. That night, 25,000 people march from Castro to City Hall. They carry candles, they sing, they cry. Joan Baez performs Swing Low Sweet Chariot. The crowd is mostly gay men who've lost their champion. But not only. There are straight allies, elderly Chinese from Chinatown, black families from the Fillmore. San Francisco mourns together, briefly united in grief before anger takes over. The trial begins May 1979. Dan White's lawyers don't deny he killed 2 men. Instead, they argue diminished capacity. The infamous Twinkie defense, though it's never actually about Twinkies, it's about depression, about a good man cracking under pressure. They point to his junk food consumption as evidence of mental illness, not cause. The prosecution, incompetent or complicit, fails to argue premeditation effectively. They don't emphasise the reloading, the crawling through windows, the coup de grace shots. May 21st, 1979. Verdict: voluntary manslaughter. Maximum sentence 7 years, 8 months. White will serve 5 years, 5 months for 2 executions. The city erupts. The White Night riots. 5,000 people attack City Hall, burn police cars, scream for justice. The police retaliate, invade the Castro, beat anyone they find. 140 injured, 60 hospitalised. The violence Dan White started spreads through the city like fire. The question everyone asks, was it homophobia? Dan White's defenders say no. He and Harvey were friendly. He voted for some gay rights measures. This wasn't about sexuality, but politics, mental health, money, pride. But how do you separate these things? In 1978 San Francisco, being gay is political. Supporting gay rights is radical. Dan White represented the old order. Harvey Milk embodied the new. That conflict doesn't need slurs to be read. Others point to deeper currents. The People's Temple mass suicide days before. The changing demographics of the city. The class warfare between old working-class families and new professional arrivals. Dan White saw his city, his people, his way of life disappearing. He blamed the progressives, the gays, the minorities. When he couldn't beat them politically, he used the only power he had left: violence. Consider the premeditation. White brings his gun, but claims he didn't plan to use it. He crawls through a window to avoid metal detectors, but says that was habit. He reloads after killing Moscone, but calls that instinct from police training. He shoots both men in the head execution style, but insists that was rage, not intent. Every action suggests planning. The jury chooses not to see it. The aftermath reshapes San Francisco. Dianne Feinstein, who wanted to be mayor but not like this, leads the city through trauma. She serves until 1988, then becomes a senator, still serving today. She was there, saw the bodies, announced the deaths. That moment in the hallway when Dan White walked past her, she was supposed to be next on his list. At least that's what investigators later believed. But White liked Feinstein, or ran out of rage, or remembered he had children. We'll never know. Harvey Milk becomes a martyr, an icon, a symbol bigger than the man himself. Streets bear his name, schools, a Navy ship. The camera store becomes a shrine. His words, "You've got to give them hope," become rallying cries. In death, he achieves what he couldn't in life. He becomes unavoidable, undeniable, immortal. Dan White serves his time in Soledad prison. Protected custody. A cop in prison needs it. He's released January 6, 1984. Returns to San Francisco briefly, then flees to Los Angeles. Can't find work. Can't escape his name. October 21st, 1985, less than 2 years after release. He connects a hose from his exhaust pipe to the cabin of his 1970 Buick. Carbon monoxide, the invisible killer. His suicide note apologizes to his family, not to the families of the men he killed. Here's what haunts. Dan White was supposed to be the good guy, veteran, cop, firefighter, family man, the resume of an American hero. But heroism without empathy becomes brutality. Service without understanding becomes oppression. He protected and served, but only those who looked like him, thought like him, loved like him. When his city expanded beyond his comprehension, he chose bullets over ballots. The trajectory was always there. The rigid thinking. The us versus them mentality. The belief that his suffering mattered more than others' lives. White complained about his $9,600 salary, while Milk fought for teenagers contemplating suicide. White worried about his potato stand while Moscone tried to heal a city traumatized by Jonestown. White's problems were real, but his solution was murder. That's not mental illness, that's entitlement. What makes a man climb through a basement window with a loaded gun? Not just anger, not just depression, but the belief that your pain justifies anything, that your loss of status permits ultimate violence. Dan White felt the city owed him something, respect, position, power. When denied, he took payment in blood. The Twinkie defense becomes shorthand for affluent white justice. Kill 2 men, claim depression, serve 5 years. Meanwhile, black men serve decades for selling drugs. The jury of White's peers, mostly white, mostly conservative, saw themselves in him. The good man pushed too far. They couldn't see Moscone and Milk as good men murdered for trying to make the city better for everyone. There's another assassination here, beyond the bullets. The assassination of San Francisco's innocents. The city of love, tolerance, acceptance, discovers it harbours the same hatred as anywhere else. Just better dressed, more polite, until it isn't. Dan White proved that scratch a liberal city deep enough, you find the same conservative rage, the same violent resistance to change. The survivors carry wounds. Diane Feinstein never forgets the feeling of checking for Milk's pulse. Harvey's partner Scott scatters his ashes in the Pacific, keeps some in a ring he wears. Anne Cronenberg, Milk's aide, was supposed to be in that office but stepped out. Survivor's guilt becomes her shadow. The entire Castro neighborhood develops a kind of communal PTSD. Joy tempered by knowledge that visibility makes you a target. Consider the timing. November 1978. Just as gay liberation seems possible, just as the closet doors open nationwide, Harvey Milk proves you can be openly gay and politically powerful. Then Dan White proves you can be murdered for it. The message is clear. Progress has a price, and that price is blood. Every minority group knows this arithmetic. Freedom equals danger. But here's what Dan White didn't understand. Martyrs multiply. Kill Harvey Milk, create 1,000 Harvey Milks. Each bullet that entered Milk's body exited as inspiration for someone else to come out, speak up, run for office. The assassination meant to silence the gay rights movement became its rallying cry. Harvey Milk stops being a person and becomes a permission to be visible, to be political, to be proud, the building remembers. San Francisco City Hall, where Dan White committed his murders, becomes the site of a different history. February 12, 2004. Mayor Gavin Newsom orders the city to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. They line up around the building where Harvey died, getting married where he was murdered. June 26, 2015. When the Supreme Court legalizes same-sex marriage nationwide, thousands gather at City Hall to celebrate. Harvey's ghost must be laughing. What would Harvey Milk think of his canonization? The man who owned a camera store, told dirty jokes, had temper tantrums, loved opera, dated younger men, reduced to a symbol, sanitized for mainstream consumption. The 2008 movie makes him noble, neglects his flaws. The saint replaced the human. Maybe that's necessary. Maybe movements need saints more than humans. But somewhere, the real Harvey, complicated, difficult, brave, disappears into myth. Dan White's children grow up knowing their father as both protector and killer. How do you reconcile that? The man who taught you to ride a bike also executed 2 men. The hands that tucked you in at night held the gun steady for headshots. They change their names eventually, disappear into normal lives. But genetics don't forget. Neither does Google. The potato stand fails, of course. The hot potato on Pier 39, Dan White's attempt at the American dream. It closes while he's in prison. Someone else takes the spot, sells coffee, succeeds. The location has no plaque, no memorial. Tourists buy lattes where a killer once worried about money, never knowing they're standing at one origin point of political assassination. Here's the brutal truth. Dan White won, partially. He killed Harvey Milk, but gay rights advanced anyway. He killed George Moscone, but progressives kept the mayoralty. He wanted his job back, died in disgrace instead. But he also proved that violence works, that assassination changes history, that one man with a gun can alter democracy's direction. Every political murder since carries Dan White's DNA. The deeper assassination, trust. After November 27th, 1978, City Hall installs metal detectors that work, locks windows, increases security. Politicians get bodyguards. The accessible democracy Harvey Milk represented. Walking the streets, answering your own phone, meeting any constituent who asked, dies with him. Fear replaces openness, barriers replace access. Dan White didn't just kill 2 men, he killed a way of governing. November 27th, 2018. 40 years later, Diane Feinstein still serves in the Senate, still flinches when asked about that day. The Castro's gentrified now, rainbow capitalism replacing revolution. Tech workers live where drag queens once ruled. The camera store is a gift shop selling Harvey Milk coffee mugs. Progress and commercialization dance on the graves of martyrs. But at night, when fog rolls through the Castro, old-timers remember. The march to City Hall with candles, the riots when justice failed, the feeling that change was possible and dangerous simultaneously. They remember Harvey not as saint but as neighbour, the guy who'd help with your campaign, fight your landlord, make you believe you mattered. That Harvey, the human one, is the real loss. What drives a man to political assassination? With Dan White, it wasn't ideology or insanity, but something more American, the rage of the entitled denied. He believed his straight white maleness guaranteed certain privileges, respect, power, position. When a gay Jew and an Italian progressive told him no, he reached for the privilege's ultimate expression, violence. The gun didn't make him powerful, it revealed his powerlessness. George Moscone is the forgotten victim. Harvey Milk gets movies, monuments, memory. Moscone gets a convention centre named after him. But he was murdered too for the crime of choosing progress over comfort, for listening to Harvey Milk over Dan White. His 4 children grow up without a father because he made a political decision that shouldn't have cost anything but a vote. The real conspiracy isn't that Dan White acted alone. He did. It's that the system protected him afterward. The cops who knew him, the prosecutors who threw the case, the jury who saw themselves in him, the judge who gave him the minimum. They didn't pull the trigger, but they made sure the trigger puller walked free in 5 years. That's how institutional violence works, not through individual acts, but collective forgiveness of those acts. Harvey Milk recorded tapes to be played if he was assassinated. He knew it was coming. Every gay leader in 1978 knew they were targets. "If a bullet should enter my brain," he said, "let that bullet destroy every closet door." Prophetic words. His assassination did more for gay rights than his life could have. Dan White created the thing he tried to destroy. Harvey Milk as eternal symbol. October 11th, 1987. The AIDS Memorial quilt is displayed on the National Mall. Thousands of panels, each representing someone lost to AIDS. Harvey Milk died before AIDS ravaged the community he fought for. He never saw his Castro decimated, never held dying friends, never watched Reagan ignore a plague. In a strange way, Dan White spared him that particular suffering. Harvey died believing in progress. The men who followed him learned progress has asterisks. The execution technique matters. Both victims shot in the head after being downed. That's not rage, it's training. Dan White, the cop, knew how to kill, not just wound. The headshots were insurance, professional technique. This wasn't temporary insanity, but muscle memory. When White claimed he didn't remember, he lied. You don't forget executing 2 men. You just pretend you do. What if? What if Dan White had gotten his job back? What if Harvey Milk had been late that day? What if Moscone had reappointed him? What if the basement window was locked? History pivots on such small hinges, but perhaps it was always heading here. The tension between old San Francisco and new couldn't hold forever. If not Dan White, another angry white man. If not Harvey Milk, another gay leader. The assassination was specific. The violence was inevitable. Here's what they don't teach. Political assassination is always a confession. Dan White confessed that democracy wasn't working for him, that voting wasn't enough, that his voice mattered more than others' lives. Every political assassin confesses the same thing, that they've lost the argument and only violence remains. It's the ultimate admission of defeat dressed up as victory. November 27th, 1978. Dan White climbs through a basement window carrying more than a gun. He carries the rage of everyone who sees their privilege slipping, their city changing, their certainty crumbling. He pulls the trigger for everyone who'd rather kill than adapt. Harvey Milk and George Moscone die for the crime of imagining a different San Francisco, a different America, a different future. Today, Harvey Milk's name adorns an airport terminal. Travellers pass through Harvey Milk Terminal 1, most not knowing who he was, why he died, what he means. It's perfect American memory, commerce and commemoration, sanitized and safe. The terminal has good coffee, free Wi-Fi, no mention of bullets or blood. Harvey would probably laugh, then organise the baristas. The lesson of November 27th, 1978 isn't that love wins or hate wins. It's that both exist simultaneously in the same city, the same building, the same human heart, Dan White loved his family and hated change. Harvey Milk loved San Francisco and fought its prejudices. George Moscone loved peace and died violently. Love and hate aren't opposites. They're neighbours, separated by the thinnest walls. In the end, we map this assassination not as tragedy but as revelation. Dan White revealed what happens when privilege feels threatened. The jury revealed how justice bends for the right defendants. The riots revealed that patience has limits. Harvey Milk's death revealed that martyrdom might be the most effective activism. Every bullet fired that day is still travelling, still finding targets, still changing trajectories. The bodies are gone, but the questions remain. How do democracies handle those who reject democratic outcomes? How do cities change without leaving people behind? How do movements survive their martyrs? How do we prevent the next Dan White, armed and aggrieved, from climbing through the next window? November 27th, 1978. 2 men die in City Hall. One becomes legend. One becomes cautionary tale. One becomes history's hero. But in that moment, in those offices, they're just bodies cooling on government carpet, blood pooling in bureaucratic spaces. The revolution and the reaction, the future and the past, the hope and the fear, all reduced to evidence markers and chalk outlines. You've got to give them hope, Harvey Milk said. But hope makes you visible. Visibility makes you a target. The target attracts the bullet. The bullet creates the martyr. The martyr inspires the movement. The movement changes the world. The changed world forgets the cost. This is the algebra of assassination, the mathematics of murder as political tool. Dan White did the calculation. Harvey Milk paid the price. We're still computing the interest. So we remember November 27th, 1978. Not as the day Harvey Milk died, but as the day Dan White proved that killing the messenger doesn't kill the message. Every pride parade, every same-sex wedding, every openly gay elected official is Harvey Milk's ghost laughing at Dan White's grave. The assassin's bullets reached their target. They just didn't achieve their goal. Harvey Milk is more alive in death than Dan White ever was in life. That's the ultimate verdict, delivered not by a jury but by history itself.